Mercifully, we can move on. Next week we have a presentation by Lydia Bodine. Is Lydia here today? So I don't care how I murder her name. Okay. Lydia is I believe she's the president of Niños Incapacitados. Everyone knows about Niños Incapacitados? And if you don't, you can find out all about it next week. They're an all-volunteer, non-profit charity that has worked in the Lake Chapala area since 1974. And their mission is to help Mexican families who require financial assistance to pay for the ongoing and major medical expenses for their children. And so Lydia will talk about how to help, a history of Niños Incapacitados. Lydia arrived in Lakeside in 2018, a refugee from California. She was a district attorney. Oh well. She's not here. I know. She specialized in cases that involved child sexual assault and domestic violence. So, and then she came here, she became the president of the Programa Pro Niños Incapacitados del Lago, that's the official name, and assumed that position in 2019. So that should be a very interesting talk. Don't miss next week. But now we have this week. And this week we have our beloved Rachel McMillen, who's going to talk about ancient knowledge for modern times. So Rachel will remind us of the state of the world, the conflict and the suffering, and ask the question, can indigenous knowledge and wisdom help us resolve this? So please give her a nice, warm, open circle. Welcome to Rachel McMillen.
Let's see if this works. Oh, yes, it does. Ooh, amazing. You know, there are a few of you here who might have seen a promo, an ad for this talk a couple of weeks ago. I can't remember where it came out, maybe in the OHO, that said I was going to talk about creative writing. And if that's true, I have to disappoint you. I am not going to talk about creative writing. I do have a course coming up on creative writing for LCS starting on Tuesday, so if you desperately want to write your memoirs, by all means go and sign up. But it's not going to help you today, okay? Today it's ancient knowledge from modern times. And it was interesting, this morning I was listening to the rain come down while I drank my coffee. And, you know, I was worrying about the really important things of life, like could I make my hair flatten out, or would my earrings go in, and all of that stuff. And I thought how serendipitous it was to have this kind of weather here, when in the background the BBC weather was talking about the fact that Spain and Portugal and France are on fire. England's got an amber alert out because temperatures are in the 40s. BC has already lost one town to fire, so we're back to the same old thing that happened last year in western US and Canada. So, you know, this is not, at least at the beginning, a happy talk. So I have to give you warning, because I don't know about you, but I'm starting to get scared as I read about what's happening in the world. So does that change the sound drastically?
No?
A little bit further out. A little bit further out, okay. That sounds better, okay. So there's droughts, there's floods, there's hurricanes, there's tornadoes, there's heat domes, there's melting ice, the list goes on and on. It's all been enough to have driven me to research the effects of something as simple and predictable as a 1 degree rise in temperature. Actually, we've already had a 1.1 degree rise in temperature. 1 degree, it's not much, and we're already well on our way. And what I've discovered certainly confirms that there's a reason to be scared. Modern science has given us amazing knowledge and new ways to make our lives easier. It's allowed us to explore the depths of the oceans and the vastness of space. I don't know if any of you have seen the images from the James Webb telescope. They truly are amazing. The light that we're looking at from those galaxies is 13 billion years old. So it's a form of time travel. Yeah, maybe they're not even there still, who knows? It's incredible. But modern science has given us computers and cell phones, it's given us electric cars and rockets and satellites, it's given us microwaves and televisions, well, I'm not too sure that latter is particularly good. It's cured diseases, it's taught us about our DNA. But as we've seen all too often, new technology often creates new and unexpected problems. Just look at fracking, where we are only now learning the long-term damage that's causing. And then there's 5G networks that may or may not cause negative health effects, genetic engineering, genetically modified foods, Monsanto and its pesticides. The list is long, and it's getting longer. And when science looks at ancient cultures, it really doesn't do so well. Archaeologists continue to unearth ancient buildings and artifacts to study what they find there. They help us learn about building techniques and mythology and religion and art. In order to learn about the day-to-day knowledge and skills of people once had, it seems we have to rely on the oral history of the various indigenous cultures remaining today. And interestingly enough, for years, scientists said that the native people in America came over about 10,000 years ago, across the ice bridge. There's an exploration going on now on Vancouver Island, in British Columbia, where the artifacts they're digging up are 15,000 years old. So I guess we will believe the indigenous oral stories more than we believe science at this point. Should we even care about when indigenous people occupied North America? Is it important to know whether or not they cultivated their land or diverted streams? About how they caught or harvested their food? Can we learn anything from them to benefit our lives today? Or perhaps even more importantly, tomorrow? When BC suffered from what scientists call a heat dome last summer, almost 700 people died. And actually I just heard today that 300 people have already died in Spain from the same thing. They were mostly older adults. 67% were 70 or older. And they mostly lived alone without air conditioning. 80% had a chronic disease or mental health disorder of some kind. But if you take out that already vulnerable population, you still have 33% of healthy younger people who lost their lives. Now, I am terrible at math, but according to my calculation, that means that 466 people who were my age lost their lives, and 233 who were the same age as my children died. That's a lot. And they're forecasting an even hotter and longer heat dome for this year. Obviously, it's already started in several places. Well, I remember Dorothy and the Tin Man and the Cowardly Lion in The Wizard of Oz. And they became frightened when they heard strange noises coming from the forest around them, and they imagined lions and tigers and bears. Oh my. Well, although I don't think of lions and tigers and bears when I hear the increasing numbers of droughts and floods, and heat domes and hurricanes, I do get a little frightened. In part because I have 2 children and 7 grandchildren living on this planet, and I would like them to be able to look forward to a life they can enjoy, or even a life. Learning about the numbers of deaths in BC made me do some research into the numbers for the total area of Western North America that was affected by that heat dome. Turns out that the peak temperature was 49.6 degrees. Now, I haven't translated that into Fahrenheit, but it is hot. There were 1,408 deaths and $8.9 billion of damage. So knowing that, what other problems are we looking at in the near future? Things like fires and droughts and floods and rising sea levels from melting ice and glaciers. Before I came to Mexico 13 years ago, I lived on a small island off the coast of Canada, Gabriel Island, just above Puget Sound. I still have many friends there. Will their homes be flooded with the higher tides and the storm surges? Sea level in New York has risen 9 inches since 1950. It's predicted to rise another 5 feet over the coming century. If that prediction comes true, not only will many of my friends' houses disappear, so too will millions of houses in the major cities of the world. Think about Los Angeles, Seattle, Atlanta, Boston, San Diego, Vancouver, Toronto, Chicago, Miami. Do any of you come from a coastal city?
Yes.
Yep, you live near the coast, near the shore? Think about it. China alone has 43 million people in precarious locations. India, well, there's 15 million living in Calcutta, and that's mostly flat. There is another 21 million in Mumbai, and that's just 2 of the cities in India on the coast. And then there's England and Holland and Portugal and Spain and all the coast of Africa, South America, Australia, where I come from, in case you're wondering about the accent, New Zealand. And we still haven't mentioned all those beautiful islands, like Hawaii and Tahiti and Rotorua. But it's not just the ocean. There's an even more critical issue with fresh water. And this is what I was thinking about this morning as rain was coming down. Will we have enough? Predictions are that by 2050, in other words, just 27 years of time, the world population will be almost 10 billion, and the demand for food will be up almost 70% compared to 2017. How do they survive without water? Well, the outlook is bleak. Scientists predict there will be no freshwater reserves left by 2040.
Oh my.
That's a mere 17 years away. It may be, if I'm lucky, in my time. Maybe unlucky, I'm not sure which. But that's going to affect not only our sons and daughters and grandchildren, but many of us as well. You and I. We need water, and lots of it, not only to drink, but to grow the food to feed ourselves. But even our largest lakes and reservoirs are not going to be of much use. The Shasta Dam in Washington is currently at 35% capacity. Lake Powell is at its lowest level since the lake was filled in the 1960s. Lake Mead is below 30%. Glenville Lake in North Carolina is almost dry. Even Utah's Great Salt Lake has dwindled below historic levels. It's lost 10 feet of elevation, 2,400 square miles of surface area. And while we can't drink the water from that lake, the loss threatens a lake-based economy worth an estimated $1.3 billion in recreation, mineral extraction, and brine shrimp. And if the lake dries up, 6,500 people would lose their source of income. So why is it happening? Well, industry has diverted the lake's method of replenishment, and a climate change-fueled mega drought choking the entire Southwest means there's less water all around Utah than there has been in the past 1,200 years. I'm going to say that again. Less water than in 1,200 years. It'll devastate wildlife and bird populations, but the effect on the human population could be even more problematic, not only in terms of income, but respiratory illness increases as lake levels decline, because people are breathing in more of the particulate matter, which includes arsenic, and that's all blows around in the air. That's true with all lakes, by the way, not just the Great Salt Lake. So let's hear the rest of the bad news before we move on to more positive things. I mentioned heat domes earlier. The Paris Agreement calls for holding the global average temperature increase to no more than 1.5 degrees. I said earlier we're already at 1.1. Scientists are predicting it will reach at least 2 degrees. So what difference does that make? Well, if the temperature of the planet increases by 1.5 degrees, there will be 350 million people exposed to drought and water shortages by 2100. If it rises by the predicted 2 degrees, that number will be 410 million. With a 1.5 degree rise, the population of vertebrate animal species will decrease by 4%. With a 2 degree rise, it'll be 8%. In other words, double. It's the same with plant loss, which will go from 8% to 16%. Insect loss will triple from 6% to 18%. And I know you're all thinking, less mosquitoes. But the fact is we need mosquitoes for our own, we do need mosquitoes. We need all insects for our own survival. What else? Well, crop output would fall from 7%, would fall to 7% instead of 3%. And that's assuming we have water to grow anything. And the amount of fish in the ocean would decrease by 3 million tons instead of 1.5 million tons. And last but not least, the number of people exposed to extreme heat waves and the resulting fires, etc., would increase from 14% to 37%. Remember the fires along the west coast last year? Entire towns in both Canada and the US were completely lost due to flames. It's happening again. Already a town in British Columbia has been burnt to the ground. And fires are raging in Portugal, as I said, Spain, France, etc. The temperatures there are above 40 degrees now. England is the same thing. There's no end in sight for at least another week and probably longer. They're calling in England, they're actually calling on people to check on their neighbours and their families to make sure they're okay. So have I scared you yet?
Yeah.
Are you beginning to hear those lions and tigers and bears? Oh my, indeed. And it would be really nice to act like a true Canadian and say, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I scared you. The truth is I'm not. I want to scare you. I am trying very hard to scare you. I hope I have scared you. I hope you leave here today with a plan to put things in place not only to help alleviate the problems, but also to convince others to join you. Well, we may not have tremendous power as individuals to tackle these looming problems. We surely could look for ways to at least try and cope with them as they arise. Now, there are indigenous cultures excuse me, that have been around for many thousands of years, and many of them have dealt with climate change-related issues. After all, humans first appeared about 300,000 years ago. They moved into Europe, Asia well over 60,000 years ago, and yet the last ice age only ended 11,000 years ago. Somehow or other, humans managed to survive. The earliest scientific evidence of indigenous occupation of Australia, a hot and mostly arid country, dates back 60,000 years. They're the oldest indigenous people on Earth. So surely they must have knowledge on how to survive in both hot and cold temperatures, and certainly in drought conditions. The Haida and other coastal tribes arrived in North America at least 15,000 years ago. The Mesopotamian civilization started a little more recently, only 10,000 years ago. They were creating cities 7,000 years ago, and they too lived in an area of very low rainfall. The Sumerians arrived more than 6,000 years ago. Then there were the Anasazi about 8,000 years ago. The Maya, who built their empire some 4,000 years ago, and the Hopi, who were latecomers. They arrived only 2,500 years ago. All these people survived drastic climate change, including, at least for some, an ice age, and yet their descendants are still around today. So how did they do it? Well, one of the things that all those ancient cultures did very well was feed themselves. Some, like the Beni people in Bolivia, who lived on a high, very arid plain, reshaped the land into mounds and planted trees, when they surrounded those mounds by shallow ditches that collected the moisture and nourished the trees they planted. Others, like the Aztecs, built floating gardens or chinampas, some of which can still be seen in Xochimilco in Mexico City. Many of you have probably been there. Mm-hmm. They fed 200,000 people with those gardens. The Hopi, like their ancestors the Anasazi, still live in a very dry area of Arizona. They're considered to be the best arid land corn farmers in the world. So respected that the Israelis came and asked if they would teach them how to grow oranges in the Negev desert. Their system is wonderfully simple. All they do is take a section of hollow corn stalk, they poke a hole in the ground, drop that corn stalk down in there, drop a corn kernel, and whatever moisture is in the air condenses, drips down and irrigates the corn. No extra water is used. Now the Israelis took that information and made small hollows in the sand, which they lined with a plastic foil. And they poked a hole in the middle and planted their tree. Same thing happens, as with the Hopi corn, moisture condensed on the plastic, runs down into the hole and waters the orange tree. Now you and I are not going to be planting corn or orange trees in the desert. At least I'm not. At least not yet. Who knows? So while that may be helpful for those currently living in a very dry area, it's not really relevant for us right now. Or is it? Do you have to water your plants in the garden in the dry season? I do. And I'm going to stop doing it. Would surrounding trees and shrubs with a foil collar save water? Maybe. Then there's the Haida. Now they live in a very wet climate, on a very remote cluster of islands, about 100 miles off the northwest coast of Canada, about 70 miles south of Alaska. You'd think the temperatures there would be very cold, but in fact, it's a temperate area, largely thanks to the warm Japanese current that sweeps up from the south. Is there anything we can learn from the Haida? Turns out that yes, there is. Those islands sit on top of the continental shelf, and the surrounding ocean is very shallow. That makes learning about ancient ways of doing things much easier than it might otherwise be. And archaeologists from various universities have discovered all kinds of tools, as well as wonderfully simple structures like fish traps. It's a kind of maze created when you drive stakes into the sea floor, and it traps the salmon and other species that swim into it. So the Haida of old could simply walk into shallow water and lift out a fresh fish for supper. There was no overkill, no waste, no accidental harvesting of unwanted species. Now the Haida of today, while not reverting to fish traps, are returning to their traditional diet, which as well as salmon includes halibut, shellfish, deer, and a lot of native plants and berries. The result is that there are very few domestic animals grazing on farms, which allows the land to return to its original form, and with it there are more beneficial insects, birds, and mammals. Not only that, but the previous very, very high rate of heart disease and diabetes have dropped dramatically, as has the cost of feeding a family. There's much less demand for imported goods. But again, you and I do not live on Haida Gwaii, and we're not going to be walking into the lake to catch our dinner. Although I did notice there's some fishermen out there today, so maybe that's wrong. But what else can we do to help mitigate the problems that are growing around along with the world's population and dependence on manufactured and imported goods? Well, perhaps we could ask ourselves how much imported food we use, how much imported food we buy. While we may not need to improve our diet health-wise the way the Haida did, the importation of goods requires transportation, and that contributes to an increase in carbon in the atmosphere, the base cause of climate change. Well, we have to rely on our leaders to do the majority of the work required to address the issues regarding climate change. The truth is that you and I can make a difference. The single most important thing for each of us to do is to protect and conserve our water. Access to adequate fresh water is an issue that has to be of prime importance everywhere, but especially here at Lakeside, despite the rain. With all the new development, fresh water, which is the very reason that this community was established back in 1531, is already in short supply. And that supply is going to get even shorter. Many wells have run dry these last few years. Various areas have been without water for days at a time. Maybe some of you live in an area that was out of water during the dry season for up to a week. At the end of the dry season last year, all the farmers with land up above the international school, off the Libramento, if they needed water for their animals, they had to get the bomberos, the fire department, to bring the water because even the water trucks, the peepers, could not fill their trucks, their tanks. And just 4 days ago, ConAgua, Mexico's National Water Commission, declared a drought emergency in northern Mexico, where 53 municipalities are experiencing extreme water scarcity, and thus opening the door to water restrictions in 5 states in Mexico. In fact, a total of 2/3 of all the municipalities in Mexico are experiencing some level of drought. Now, I don't know about you, but I think that's getting a little close to comfort. So what can we do? Well, we can take a leaf out of the Aztec Book of Wisdom. They conserved water by just creating floating gardens. The plants they grew needed no extra water, and the shade the floating rafts the gardens were built on reduced evaporation from the lake. Or we could look to the Australian Aborigines who lived in a place where 70% of the land is classified as desert, and who dug underground water reservoirs and created wells and tunnels that channeled and filtered the water. Now, while we may not be able to do the same thing in our gardens, although it's certainly possible to sink a tank into the earth, during the wet season we can collect rainwater and use it to water our indoor plants and to wash our dogs and our car and anything else that needs washing. In fact, this morning I thought I could go stand in the rain and wash myself. In the dry season, we can use grey water from our sinks and washing machines. We can plant cactus in the sunny spots and shade-tolerant plants under the trees. If you plan on growing vegetables, you can follow the example of the Beni in Bolivia. Instead of planting on flat ground, you plant on a mound. It gives you much more surface area, and it's much more effective at retaining water. We can cover the earth around our plants with shade cloth to prevent evaporation. We can get rid of our sprinklers and use soaker hoses to avoid water loss by evaporation. Even with the tools of modern living, we can conserve water. We can make sure our dishwashers are full before we turn them on. We can collect all that water we waste while waiting for the shower to get hot. I only know 2 people who put a bucket in their shower and collect all that water, and it's amazing. It fills completely in one shower. It's a lot of water. We can collect all that water we waste. We can even reuse water we use to boil eggs or vegetables if we want to. It may not sound like much, but it all adds up to several gallons a day. Multiply that by all the households in the community, and it would make a very big difference. What else? Well, if you don't have a garden, plant one. Trees are the only thing that nature has given us that takes carbon dioxide out of the air. We need lots of them. In this climate, and with our soil, trees grow fast. And in addition to removing carbon dioxide, they add oxygen and provide shade that helps counteract the heat. Mexico City has successfully reduced the level of smog and pollution in the city, in part by planting trees along the streets and vines on overpasses and bridges. Combined with reducing the number of cars on the road, although interestingly they still have more cars in Guadalajara, which now has more pollution than Mexico City, it's been so effective that they have managed to reduce their pollution by a large degree. And again, we can learn from the Haida, use only local plants. They don't require extra care or extra water. We can get rid of lawns, grow herbs and vegetables and fruit trees. If you live in a condo or apartment, you can still grow plants. That'll help clean the air. And if you choose edible plants like herbs, they improve your diet. And then, of course, the problems and therefore the solutions for dealing with climate change are not just local, they're global. So if you're a snowbird or a sunbird, encourage your city town to plant fruit trees in parks and along streets. But how effective, really, how effective can one individual be? Well, one couple in Brazil has planted 2 million trees over 18 years. And in doing so, they successfully brought back 172 bird species, 33 mammals, 15 amphibians, and 293 plant species. Now, I doubt any of us would be willing to go to those lengths. But even a few trees and shrubs, either planted in the ground or in pots, is a step in the right direction. I do know one woman in Colima, a small city about 2.5 hours from here, and she plants trees and shrubs in vacant lots and turns them into parks. And in fact, There's a woman here, I don't see her here today, Judy Dykstra-Brown, lives in the Racket Club. And she has done exactly the same thing. She's taken the vacant lot next to her house and turned it into a park. Another thing we need to stop doing is using pesticides and herbicides in our garden. Neonics are America's most used class of pesticide. They're found in the vast majority of corn and soybean crops. We all remember the problems created by DDT and how its highly persistent byproducts accumulated in the bodies of birds where it piled up in the fatty tissue and caused eggshell thinning and reproductive collapse in the birds at the top of the food chain, the hawks and the eagles and the ospreys, the falcons, the cormorants, even brown pelicans. The problem with DDT spurred the chemical industry to develop new insecticides, most recently neonics. They can be applied as a seed coating to, for example, a single kernel of corn. But the insecticide is then absorbed into every part of the growing plant, from its roots and stems to its pollen, and the plant becomes toxic to any insect that nibbles at it. If swallowed, just one neonic-treated kernel of corn, just one, is enough to kill a jay-sized bird. It only takes 4 pinhead-sized coated canola seeds to kill a sparrow-sized bird. Even worse, because most of the insecticide comes off in the soil, it's increasingly found in rivers, streams, and lakes, where it's harming populations of emergent insects on which aerial insectivores like swallows, swifts, and flycatchers depend. Do we care? We should. Do we want to see the end of swallows that eat millions of mosquitoes every day? Their numbers have already declined by 32%. And if it only takes the amount of coating on one kernel to kill a bird the size of a jay, how many does it take to kill a child? Or create a major health problem? We know there's several villages around the lake where a large number of children have kidney disease. San Petroitscan on the other side of Miscala is one of them. And in fact, Cruz Roja is planning to incorporate 16 dialysis stations into its new facility to address the problem. The cause is not the lake. If it was the lake, every community around the lake would have the problem. These villages take their water from wells, and that water flows down through the earth from cornfields and milpas planted higher up on the mountain. And they have treated seeds. The water then becomes contaminated with pesticides and herbicides and fertilizers from the milpas. And perhaps the saddest thing of all of this is that the use of these pesticides, while they do provide crop protection from about 5 different pests, they do not increase crop yield. In fact, 89% of field trials saw no increase in corn yield using neonic-treated seeds, while other studies, including one by the EPA, found a similar lack of yield benefit for soybean farmers. So it seems like the only one benefiting is the chemical companies. So why am I standing here today harping on at you about pesticides and farms and crop yields when we all live here in this lovely little community in nice houses with little gardens and condos and things? Well, those same pesticides are used on golf courses and in home flea treatment for pets. That means that one of the things we can do to help address the growing climate change yield and problems is quit using pesticides on our trees and gardens and make sure we only use a brand like Frontline, which doesn't have neonics in it, or better still, a natural flea treatment on our pets. What else? Well, obviously we can reuse and recycle. One of the things we consistently find when we open up middens in ancient settlements is bones and shells, almost nothing else. Now, of course, they use mostly natural materials for cooking and eating, and bark and wood and woven cedar strips. I notice in most of Malaya and Indonesia now, somewhat in India, they are using banana leaves for all their takeouts, for anything else, and we can certainly, looking around, do the same. But the indigenous people took care never to damage the trees or the land the grass came from. And even ceramic is recyclable. What is not is plastic. Try and get plastic out of your lives. Buy bulk when possible. Take your own container. Use your own ceramic cup if you go take out drinks. Now I know it all sounds probably like a lot of work, but I suspect that when we're standing in line for hours with a bucket to collect our daily ration of water, like the folk up there in the 53 municipalities in northern Mexico, it will all seem pretty easy. It's said that knowledge is power, and we are going to need all of it in the years ahead. Thank you. If anybody has any questions, I can field them from here. I know we don't have a microphone wandering around, so yes.
My question is, I come from Canada, and I want to know, is there a community composting here in Alki? Because I have a lot of people I see throwing out food waste. I see food waste in plastic bags, you know, for the garbage to pick up. And if there was a community composting, I would participate if there is one.
Has anybody heard of a community composting? It's a great idea.
I'm only here for 5 weeks.
It's a great idea. We should ask LCS. LCS might be the one to just start it, right? Because it has enough influence and power in the community that it could, very well get something like that going, and it would be a huge benefit. I agree. What part of Canada?
Northern Alberta.
Okay, not far away. Anybody else? Yes.
Thank you for compiling all of that, Rachel. What about the recycling program here? Do you know if that's working, or, I mean, there's a lot of plastic we just toss.
There is, and I have seen and heard different answers to that. I don't know that there is a recycling bin. I'm staying currently just one block over. There's a recycling bin there for bottles and things like that. But that's all, and it's not a very big bin, and it usually overflows. So what the program is, I don't know. Does anybody know exactly what the state of that is now?
I know somewhat about it. It's all run by volunteers.
Okay.
And they have several of those cestos around Ahi. And I would really encourage everyone to use them. They have a cesto for bottles, for plastic bottles. And you should take the labels off and squash them and put the top back on. Clean the milk bottles, put the top back on and squash them. They also have a bin for glass bottles, and they have some sort of a container for cardboard. And they are picked up, but it's all done by volunteers.
So is there a business where that takes these? Is the...
No, it's all done by, the pickups, I believe, are all done by volunteers, and they have a recycling center. I haven't been out to it because I don't have a car. And they, actually, I think it's Mama Cleo's boys that come over and help with the sorting, and then they pay somebody to truck the recycled goods to, usually to Guadalajara, and they get paid for them. So that covers the cost of the gas and the truck, etc.
Excellent.
So yeah, they're trying.
Right.
It's not easy, and it's all volunteers.
Thank you. And please, when you're washing the bottles, etc., use old dishwater, use whatever, don't use fresh water. I mean, we seem we have plenty now. We turn on the tap and out it comes. We're within 17 years of having none. And that's serious, that's scientific fact, and we've seen some of that here already. So start using all your grey water, etc. Anybody else? Yes?
So there are two locations you can take recycling. One is just past Mi Pueblita on the west side, on the Carretera. And that here, right out there, there's a building there, and they've got a ton of recycling for all sorts of things out there. So you can just bring your things, and there's someone there all the time. Also, La Floresta, if you go where the sculpture is, and you go up the mountain, at the very end of that street, there's recycling bins, large recycling area there that you can take your things.
Excellent. Did everybody hear that?
No.
Okay, there are two, correct me if I'm wrong, there's two recycling sites. One is out west, just past La Pueblita, where you can take all your recycling. The other one is in La Floresta, where the sculpture is. If you go straight up the hill, then you will find recycling bins for all kinds of recycling. Yes?
I kind of have 2 points. I read, and I didn't read it thoroughly, but evidently in Sri Lanka, they're having riots now because of the Green Revolution, which they brought in, which has made farmers not be able to grow enough food for the land. So that's, I think, one thing we do have to think about, that for every improvement we make, somebody is suffering from that.
Possibly,
in
yes.
very real ways. The other thing I wonder is, we never talk about cars and these big trucks. I am a walker, so I have a lot of concern about this, because even I come from Portland, where the traffic is so bad now that you make no effort to see a friend who lives 5 miles away because you can't get there. Public transportation in Portland is terrific, but nobody uses it. They prefer their cars, one car, 2 cars. And I'm not anti-car, but I am saying I think we have, although I totally approve of recycling, but we have major cultural problems here that we have to start talking about.
We do. Just a couple of comments on that. Sri Lanka does have riots. It is because of years and years of very bad government. They have finally got their prime minister, their leader, to resign. He has finally officially resigned. He left the country a couple of days ago. He has finally resigned. But it is a combination of climate change, all kinds of things, monetary problems. It's not the Green Revolution that caused it. As far as traffic goes and transportation, I totally agree. Holland runs all their trains, fast trains, on wind power. Absolutely everything. One windmill can run a train for 5,000 miles. One windmill. Now, yes, you need to be in a place that's windy. There's a lot of those. But we are doing very, very little in terms of encouraging, at least at government level and higher levels, to encourage the use of electric cars, etc., and to switch away from oil and gas, which are a major problem. So yes, that's absolutely true. We need to really work on that. Thank you. Anybody else? In that case, I will thank you all for coming and for listening. And, see you again.